I should start by mentioning that I don't consider myself a particularly spiritual person. In fact, I usually think of myself as more of a skeptic. That said, I am 100% convinced of the existence of ghosts, demons, and other paranormal things. I've even had my own encounters with demons in the past. For a bit of background, I'm a 29-year-old guy from a tiny town in rural Kentucky with a population of about 300. Although I was actually born in a bigger city of around 55,000, I now live in the middle of nowhere with my 76-year-old grandmother, and I've been here for a few years after a rough divorce. We do have neighbors about 50 yards down the road, but it's pretty peaceful out here. The house I live in is an older one, built sometime in the early 1900s, but it's been modernized with things like motion-activated porch lights. The road we live on is flanked by cornfields and woods, so it's pretty isolated and quiet. This experience took place one winter night when I was the only one awake in the house. I work night shifts, so a regular sleep schedule isn't really an option for me. It's not uncommon for me to be up at odd hours of the night. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone during a decent snowfall. Since we didn't have internet at the time, I was browsing through a local online marketplace, looking for project cars. I glanced up from my phone and saw the biggest white-tailed buck I'd ever laid eyes on. It had to weigh at least 230 pounds, maybe more. Mesmerized, I watched it graze for a bit. Everything was calm when suddenly, a massive black, furry shape lunged out of nowhere and tackled the deer to the ground. The struggle lasted maybe 10 or 15 seconds before the buck went still. Through the snowfall, I managed to get a better look at the creature. It looked like a huge black wolf. Wolves were once common in Kentucky, but were mostly wiped out in the wild in the 1800s because of deforestation and industrial expansion. So we don't see them around here anymore. We do have plenty of coyotes, but they usually hunt in packs. This creature, however, was alone. After the deer was dead, the beast calmed down and got back up on all fours. I was stunned by its size. For reference, I'm about 5 feet 7 inches and weigh 205 pounds, and this thing had to be at least 4 feet tall at the shoulders. Its fur was so dark it made it hard to see any details, but under the light of the full moon, I could make out some of its features. I can't recall the exact time, but if I had to guess, it was around 12:45 a.m. I let out a small gasp when I saw the creature attack the deer. I was frozen, unable to move or speak. All I could do was watch as fear washed over me. The creature dragged the buck away in its jaws, its sharp teeth at least 4 inches long. Its muscles rippled under its fur as it carried the deer into the woods across the road, and just like that, it vanished. I didn't see it for the rest of the night. All I could do afterward was try to get some sleep, though I wish I could say that was the last time I saw it. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke up still trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. After breakfast, I got dressed and went outside to see if I could find any traces of the creature, to convince myself it wasn't just a hallucination. But there were no tracks, no blood, and no signs of a struggle. The fresh snow had covered any evidence. I started to doubt what I saw until I looked up into the trees. There, 30 or 40 feet up, were the remains of the buck. Whatever had attacked it had devoured most of the animal, leaving only the skull and spine hanging in a blood-soaked tree. I was horrified. I gathered myself and tried to carry on with my day, thinking that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, I had another encounter. As I mentioned, it's not unusual for me to be awake late at night. As I type this, it's about 3:30 a.m. where I live. I'm a heavy sleeper. Earthquakes, storms, and even loud noises rarely wake me. That night, though, I was sound asleep when I was jolted awake by an overwhelming feeling of dread. The porch light had been triggered. Everything inside me was screaming not to move, to stay on the couch and go back to sleep. But I couldn't ignore the urge to find out what was causing that fear. I lifted my head, still wrapped in my blanket, and looked out the window. The the same window where I had first seen the creature. There it was again, staring right at me. We locked eyes for what felt like ages. The moment I saw its glowing red eyes, my blood ran cold. I couldn't speak or move. All I could manage was a shaky gasp, as though I wanted to cry but couldn't. My first instinct was to hide under my blanket like a frightened child, but I didn't know what else to do. I lay there for several minutes, praying that the beast wouldn't break into the house and make me its next meal. I could hear its long claws tapping against the porch as it paced back and forth. Then, it let out a scream, an eerie, bone-chilling sound that made me feel sick. It was like a mix of a train whistle and a wolf's howl, a sound I'll never forget. After what seemed like forever, the sound stopped and the porch light went out. I finally exhaled in relief. I'm not a religious person and my family is Christian, but I've never been particularly devoted. Even so, I'm not sure what I saw those nights. After the second encounter, I did some research and everything I read points to it being a hellhound. Hellhound sightings are incredibly rare in these parts, but stories of them date back to the 1600s in New England. For those who don't know, a hellhound is said to be a guardian of the underworld, similar to Cerberus from Greek mythology, a massive, black dog that guards the gates of the afterlife. Folklore also claims they are omens of death. There's an old saying that goes, if you see the black dog once, it brings joy. If twice, it brings sorrow. And the third time means death. I don't know about anyone else, but I've seen this creature 4 times, and each time, all I've felt is raw, primal fear. Fortunately, I haven't seen it for months now, and I hope it stays that way. I doubt shooting it would do much good, so all I can do is hope it never comes back, and that I don't end up on its list of meals. Folklore is an odd thing. Tales handed down through the years, stories that have somehow stood the test of time. Why do some stories disappear like the last sparks of a dying fire, while others stay alive forever? I think for a story to become folklore, it needs to teach a timeless lesson, and most of all, have some truth to it. Sure, some parts get exaggerated like in a game of telephone, but the core message stays the same. The truth sits somewhere between the suspense and the sudden jolts, and we can feel it. We sense the storyteller's belief in the tale, and that stays with us, follows us home, urging us to share it too. There's something about saying it aloud that makes it feel lighter, less believable, but we know better. Let me tell you about a local legend from where I grew up and the night it became real for me. My granddad used to tell us this story on warm summer evenings as we sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the trees and the night creeping in. Now, listen closely, he would start. This isn't just any ghost story. It's the truth with a bit of a bite. Years ago, there was a family living out here, moving closer to town. They'd spent all day hauling their stuff back and forth. The father drove the truck, the son sat beside him, and their daughter, Lily, was in the back with the furniture, making sure nothing flew off. As they crossed the bridge just down the road, you know the one, something terrible happened. A gust of wind caught one of the heavier pieces of furniture, pulling it off the truck, and Lily along with it. Poor girl. As she tumbled out, she got swept under the wheel of the truck, and it took her head clean off, tossing it into the murky water below the bridge. Everyone around here knows it's bad luck to bury someone incomplete. The spirit won't rest unless the body is whole. So, the whole town pitched in to help search for Lily's head, so her family could lay her to rest properly. But despite all their efforts, it was never found. Even today, her head still lies somewhere in the dark waters below. They say if you cross the bridge at night, Lily's ghost might jump onto your car, searching for her head. And if you don't get across quick enough, she might just take yours instead. Granddad always followed that tale with a story about Ike, a farmhand who once had an encounter with Lily's spirit. Ike, a superstitious man, lived on the far side of Lily's Bridge and had to cross it daily to get to my granddad's farm. I dreaded crossing the bridge at night, so my granddad started letting him borrow the tractor to ease his fear and get him home faster. One night, as Ike was heading home, he was halfway across the bridge when the tractor sputtered and stopped without reason. I kept trying to restart it, but the machine was dead. That's when he felt it. The air around him seemed to buzz. His skin tingled with goosebumps, and his hair stood on end. Then, the tractor jolted, as if something heavy had landed on it. Ike felt what he described as hundreds of tiny threads brushing against his neck and crawling towards his face. That's when he caught the smell, the foul stench of swamp mud. The sensation spread across his cheeks, and his vision blurred as if something was covering his eyes. He leapt from the tractor and ran the rest of the way across the bridge. When he reached the other side, he turned and saw the tractor bounce again, like something had jumped off. I quit his job the very next day, and Granddad had to retrieve the tractor because I wouldn't go near that bridge again, even in daylight. I loved that story and begged Granddad to tell it over and over. I must have heard it 100 times. Over time, my fear of Lily and her bridge faded, the legend becoming just another familiar tale to me. But then, I experienced its truth firsthand. Years later, as a teenager, I'd sneak out at night to mess around with friends. One summer evening, we were hanging out in a loft, filled with stolen road signs, when someone had a bright idea. "We should grab a sign from Lily's Bridge," one friend suggested. Everyone agreed it was a brilliant plan. "You live closest," another friend pointed out. "It'll be easy for you." I hesitated, but I couldn't say no, or they'd never let me live it down. So, it was decided I would head to Lily's Bridge and return with a sign. That night was sweltering as I slipped out of my bedroom window and grabbed my tools. I hopped in my golf cart and drove towards the bridge. The air was thick and muggy, but the rush of wind against my face made it bearable. As I neared the bridge, the dark seemed to press in on me, and my headlights flickered off the yellow-striped sign at the bridge's entrance. That was my target. Just as I reached the bridge, my golf cart began acting up, picked up speed, then slowed to a crawl, and finally stopped entirely, plunging me into darkness. "Great," I muttered, thinking the battery was dead, though that didn't make sense. It had been fully charged. I kept trying to start it, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the headlights flickered on and off, lighting up the bridge for a moment before plunging me back into blackness. Then I heard it, something moving in the water below, followed by a soft dripping sound. When the lights flashed on again, I saw something on the bridge, a yellowish clump of what looked like hair lying in the middle of the road. My heart raced. I knew what it was before my mind could accept it. Slowly, the strands of hair began to rise, one by one, as if pulled by static. Soon, a face emerged, with a single eye staring right at me. The lights flickered out again, but I could feel it. It was watching me. I frantically tried to start the golf cart. After what felt like forever, the engine finally kicked in. I threw the cart into reverse and sped away from the bridge, hearing a splash behind me as I left. Now that I have kids of my own, they often ask me to tell that story on cold nights around the fire. I always oblige, knowing that telling a story somehow makes it seem less real. Maybe it's the company, the laughter when the story ends, or the way they ask, "Is it true?" just before bed. No, I tell them it's just a story. Now go to sleep, but deep down, we all know better stories like this stick around because they hold just a bit of truth. I grew up in a rough environment. My mom left my dad when I was very little, and we were left struggling. My dad had to work 2 jobs just to cover rent, so he was rarely home. This meant that from around the age of 9, I was mostly on my own, learning how to take care of myself until I eventually went off to college. Fortunately, I earned a scholarship which allowed me to pursue higher education. I majored in wildlife conservation, something that always fascinated me. I loved studying how animals interacted and thrived in their environments. After years of dedication, I graduated with a master's degree in wildlife biology. I started searching for jobs near my hometown, but nothing was available within 25 miles. Eventually, I found a position in Houston, Texas. I was relieved that I didn't have to move out of state, so I quickly sent in my application. A few days later, I was called in for an interview. I drove up to Houston, met with the company, and was thrilled to receive the job offer. After the interview, I explored the city and found a small apartment in a quiet area. It was cozy, perfect for a single guy like me. I lived in that apartment for about 4 years before deciding to propose to my girlfriend, Emily. She said yes, and we got married shortly after. Not long after our wedding, we moved out of the apartment and bought a small house. Fast forward several years, and we had 3 children. Life was hectic. The constant noise, traffic, and cramped living space made it hard to cope. So we decided to move to a quieter area. We found a lovely house in the town of Silver Creek, about a 25-minute drive from my office. It was a peaceful town, and our new home was in a gated community with only about 25 houses. Our new neighborhood was serene, surrounded by nature, which was perfect for me as a wildlife lover. The kids loved the house, and so did Emily. It had 4 bedrooms, a large living room, and a pool in the backyard that overlooked Pine River, a small creek that ran behind our house. The river wasn't very deep, just about 3 feet, and every now and then we'd go down to watch turtles swim by, which the kids enjoyed. Years went by, and our kids grew up, leaving me with a bit of free time to learn how to golf. There was a golf course across the river, and after a few weeks, I bought a golf cart. One summer evening, Emily took the girls out for a mother-daughter night, leaving me with some free time. I decided to hit the golf course before sunset. It was around 6 p.m., so I had plenty of daylight left. I hopped into my golf cart and headed towards the course. To get there, I had to drive down a small alley between 2 houses and cross a bridge over Pine River. As I crossed the bridge, I heard a splash in the water. Curious, I stopped the cart and peered over the edge, but saw nothing in the water. The creek was clear, unlike most rivers in the area, but no fish, no turtles, nothing. I brushed it off and continued to the golf course. After a couple of hours of golfing, it got too dark to see, so I packed up my clubs and headed home. As I was driving, I noticed some forgotten golf balls in a sand trap. I needed more, so I got out to pick them up. As I bent down, I heard a sharp cry in the distance. I looked around but didn't see anything, just trees and the bridge far off. I thought it might have been a fox, as they make sounds that can resemble a human scream. A thought struck me. Maybe an animal had fallen into the creek when I heard that splash earlier. I rushed to the bridge, hoping to help, but once again, there was nothing. Confused, I went home, cleaned up, and got ready to grill some burgers. As I flipped the burgers, I heard another scream, louder this time. I walked over to the riverbank to check, but once again, found nothing. By now, I was getting spooked. Later, as I ate my dinner, staring out at the yard through the window, everything was quiet. That silence was broken when Emily and the girls returned home. They were exhausted, but after giving me a hug, they went straight to bed. I was still unsettled by the strange noises when one of my daughters called out, "Dad, why is Grandma Rita in the backyard?" Rita was our elderly neighbor who the girls thought of as their grandma. I looked outside, and sure enough, an old woman was standing by the creek. I squinted to make out her figure. It did look like Rita, but why was she out so late? Emily whispered, "What's she doing out there?" "I'm not sure," I replied. I went outside and called, "Rita, are you okay?" She didn't respond. As I got closer, I noticed a foul odor, like stagnant water. "Do you need help?" I asked again. No answer. Puzzled, I walked back inside and told Emily I'd go check on her husband, Tom. I rang their doorbell and Tom answered, surprised to see me so late. "Want a drink? Rita can grab one for you," he said. To my shock, Rita poked her head out from the kitchen. "Wait, Rita, you're inside? I just saw you in my backyard," I exclaimed. The couple exchanged uneasy glances before Tom said, "Sounds like you met her." "Who?" I asked. "That woman by the river. We call her Evelyn. She's not someone you want to meet." They explained that they'd seen this mysterious figure a few times before and had even tried to confront her, but she just screamed and disappeared. At that moment, panic struck me. I rushed home, where I found the back door wide open. I dashed upstairs to find my family huddled in the closet, terrified. "She's inside the house," my wife cried. I grabbed a bat and slowly walked downstairs, only to find the strange woman on the steps, staring at me with lifeless eyes. She backed away and slipped out the back door, leaving water droplets on the floor. I bolted back upstairs, told my family it was just Rita to calm them down, and we spent the rest of the night at Tom and Rita's house. The next day, we searched the local library for answers. We found an old article from 1910 about a woman found dead in a nearby creek. Could it have been her? We never found out. Since that night, we moved far away. Tom and Rita eventually moved too, but they told us they occasionally still saw Evelyn by the river. We can only hope she's found peace. Back in early July 2020, something strange happened. I was part of a hiking group for teenagers in northern Greece at the time, and that's where this unsettling event took place. It was a warm evening, and I had spent the day with my group, enjoying a campfire with songs and games. One thing about me, though, is that I like to smoke, so after the night's activities ended, I'd often go off by myself to smoke quietly. That night, after everything wrapped up, I wandered into the forest near our campsite to enjoy my cigarette alone. It was peaceful, with the wind rustling through the trees and distant birds calling. About 20 or 30 meters away, I saw some deer grazing. I watched them for a while, scrolling through my phone to pass the time, making sure not to disturb them. It felt comforting to have them nearby. After around half an hour, things changed. The usual forest sounds faded. The birds stopped chirping, and the small animals moving around seemed to vanish. I noticed that even the deer had stopped eating. They looked around nervously, as if sensing something. Then, out of nowhere, a loud howl broke the silence. It sounded like a mix of a man's scream and an animal's howl. I knew immediately that this wasn't normal. There weren't any wolves in the region, so I knew something wasn't right. Having spent time outdoors since I was a kid, I knew sudden silence in the woods could mean one thing. A large predator was nearby. I stayed still and quiet, barely breathing. Then the howl came again, this time much closer. The deer bolted, leaving me standing there, deep in the woods, completely alone. I could hear rustling in the bushes ahead, maybe 25 or 30 meters away. That's when I saw them. Two glowing amber yellow eyes staring straight at me from the bushes. It was like they were piercing right through me, and I froze in place, terrified. The eyes were low at first, but soon, whatever creature it was stepped out of the shadows. It was a full moon that night, so I saw it clearly. The creature stood on two legs, much taller than a human, maybe over 2 meters tall. Its legs bent backward like a dog's, but its arms ended in clawed hands, not paws. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, with a reddish tint, and its head. It was like a wolf, but more terrifying. Its long snout and pointed ears reminded me of something straight out of a nightmare, and its eyes had an almost human look to them. I realized I was face to face with something that could only be described as a werewolf. Slowly, I stood up, careful not to make any sudden moves. I didn't want it to see me as prey, so I began to back away, step by step, hoping to make it back to the camp. But it mirrored my movement, coming closer, showing its sharp teeth. I knew it was getting ready to strike. Suddenly, it snarled and swiped its claws at a nearby tree, closing the distance between us. Just as it got about 10 meters away from me, a deer shot out from the bushes. It seemed to distract the creature. It glanced between me and the deer, then let out a howl before dropping onto all fours and racing after the deer instead. As soon as it disappeared into the woods, I ran as fast as I could back to camp, shaking uncontrollably. When I got there, my friends saw how pale and sweaty I was and asked if I was okay. I told them not to worry, though I could barely speak. That night, I lay in my tent, unable to sleep, listening to every sound outside. I could still hear howls in the distance. I left the group not long after that and never returned. The memory of that creature still haunts me, and I often have nightmares of it following me through the trees. To anyone reading this, be careful when you're out in the wilderness. You never know what might be lurking, waiting for its chance to strike. I was lucky to get away that night, but next time you might not be so fortunate. It all began when my relatives came to visit from Colorado to Oregon for a family gathering. A few days after the event, we decided to take a trip to a beach by the coast to relax. We spent several hours paddleboarding, fishing, chatting with family, and enjoying fresh fruits on the soft, warm sand. As the evening approached, this was in Oregon, so the sun stayed up until nearly 9 p.m. We packed up our things. We wanted to show our cousins an old abandoned fort nearby. The fort was fascinating. It was built in a unique shape, with rooms along the edges and a long, dark hallway running down the middle. The structure was embedded in a hillside, and you could climb on top of it to get a great view from the edge. While most of the group stayed down with our aunt, let's call her Lisa, I followed along but was soon by myself exploring. Lisa asked, "Hey kids, do you want to go up and walk on top of the fort?" Everyone was excited about the idea except for me. I'd been there many times before. Still, I went up with them. The top of the fort was smooth and grassy, sloping into the forest on the far side. Eventually, my aunt and cousins wandered back down to the ground, leaving me alone on top. I foolishly decided not to head back the same way, but instead walked around the entire flat surface of the fort. Halfway across, an unsettling feeling crept over me. They say that when you're in real danger, your heart races, and that's exactly what happened. My chest tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding. Something was off. The birds that usually circled the area had gone silent, as if they had vanished. I scanned the surroundings and noticed a deer standing at the edge of the woods, staring at me. At first, I felt relieved, but something was wrong. As I focused on the deer, I saw its eyes, forward-facing and unnaturally sharp, like a predator's. My stomach dropped. I knew enough about animals to realize that this was far from normal. At 14 years old, I was a huge fan of wildlife, and this deer's eyes were simply wrong. They weren't the kind of eyes you'd see on a gentle creature. I didn't know what to do. For some strange reason, I remembered a TV show where characters had to keep their eyes on a bird to avoid getting attacked. So, I locked my gaze on the deer and began slowly backing away. As I kept watching, the deer's neck twisted in an eerie, unnatural circle, its bizarre eyes still glued to me. Panic set in. Okay, once you reach the slope, you're going to run. Run fast, I told myself. The deer remained twisted in that impossible position, staring. I couldn't take the fear any longer. I bolted. Thanks to all the time I'd spent running, I made it to the parking lot in what felt like no time at all. "What's going on?" Lisa and my mom asked when they saw my panic. I quickly explained everything, insisting that we needed to leave immediately. Later, when we got home, I told the rest of the family. One of my other aunts, let's call her Tina, asked if it could have been something supernatural like a shapeshifter or something else. I wasn't sure what it was, but I just knew that the deer was wrong. Its eyes, its movements, everything. My other aunt, Rose, suggested it might have been a creature she'd heard of called a not deer. To this day, I'm not sure if it was some strange cryptid, a shapeshifter, or simply the creepiest deer ever. But I'm thankful that whatever it was didn't chase me or try to harm me as I ran. My encounter on Mount Haverly by James Holtman first. I want to say that I don't recommend anyone pushing their luck in this area. Something is just off about it. Mount Haverly in Preston County, New Hampshire, seems like a regular place for hiking, horse riding, and biking. But it's far from ordinary. Many creepy stories have come from there, and some believe the mountain is cursed. To be honest, a lot of terrifying events have occurred. In the 1700s, a strange creature reportedly attacked a wagon. Several hikers have vanished, only to be found in areas that had already been searched. There are also stories of ghostly kids, a red-haired hitchhiker, eerie noises, and roaring from deep within the forest. The scariest story involves a man who disappeared while on a bus headed for Preston. He was on the last stop before it, but when the bus arrived at its destination, he was gone. There might be something happening up there. The native tribes of the area avoided the peak except for burials. In 2013, I had my own frightening experience there. I always come prepared with a map, compass, food, drinks, and a whistle in case I get lost. When I set foot on Mount Haverly for a hike, a thick fog rolled in. I hoped it wouldn't rain or storm. At first, everything seemed fine, but I soon noticed an odd silence. My footsteps sounded like they were sinking into mud, and I could barely hear the chirping of birds or the hum of insects. After some time, I came across a torn shirt, like someone had cut it up with a knife. I remembered the stories of the Haverly creature and felt a shiver, but I kept moving forward. After a while, the fog became so dense that I couldn't tell where I was. I looked down and saw shoe prints, size 9, probably a Nike brand, the same size I was wearing. Oddly, the footprints circled around to where I stood, meaning I had walked in a complete loop. I blew my whistle, hoping for an echo, but heard nothing. No matter which direction I took, I ended up in the same place. It made no sense. Then I heard the crunching of leaves, like someone else was nearby. I swear I saw a man in a flannel shirt pass by through the mist, but he disappeared as quickly as he came. Shortly after, I noticed a strange rock with something carved into it, man-eater, with an arrow pointing at the stone. It seemed like a weird joke, but I didn't stick around to find out. Continuing on, I found a pair of cracked sunglasses. At this point, I started to wonder if I would end up like the people who left these items, abandoned and lost in the woods. I pulled out my compass, but the needle kept spinning, possibly because of some magnetic disturbance. I was completely lost, confused, and anxious. I blew my whistle again, but the silence continued. I tried calling the ranger's office, but there was no phone service. I was starting to feel desperate when a man in a yellow raincoat appeared through the mist. He asked if I needed help, and I told him I was lost. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, I've been here forever. If you've passed the Man-Eater Rock, head west or north, and you'll be fine. East or south will just get you more lost." I thanked him and followed his advice, heading north. As I walked, the fog began to lift, and I could finally see where I was going. I made it back to where I had started, checked my watch, and noticed the time, 2:32 p.m. I had begun the hike at 2 o'clock. There was no way I had only been out there for half an hour, but maybe I had. Or perhaps I let my imagination get the best of me after that experience. To this day, I'm not sure what really happened on Mount Haverly, but I've promised myself I'll never go back.